Welcome to my channel. Before we jump into this shocking true story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because a lot of work went into uncovering the real events behind this deadly manhunt. In 1856 Texas, the hunters who believed they held all the power quickly learned that the tables could turn, and in the harsh wilderness, those who sought to capture others found themselves facing a deadly fate they never expected. The initial slave hunting party in Texas during 1856 was known across the region for its ruthless efficiency. These men were seasoned trackers and hunters, hardened by years of chasing enslaved people who tried to escape the oppressive bonds of the plantations. Their reputation alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of the local enslaved population. They traveled with bloodhounds, rifles, and whips, moving in organized groups, carefully studying the terrain and using every trick to anticipate escape routes. Many of them had grown wealthy and powerful off the backs of the enslaved, seeing it as both business and sport to capture anyone who dared defy the law of the time. They were not just hunters, they were the embodiment of terror in the region. Plantation owners would hire them to track down runaway enslaved people, promising large sums of money or livestock as payment. Some even operated independently, seeing a runaway as a personal challenge to test their skills. Their methods were merciless. They would interrogate anyone suspected of helping escapees, burn fields or homes, and leave a trail of destruction as a warning to others. They studied the behavior of enslaved communities, memorizing river crossings, forests, and hidden paths. Every detail mattered. These men believed themselves untouchable, operating under the assumption that no enslaved person or sympathizer could outsmart them. The group that set out in 1856 was particularly infamous. Composed of 5 hunters who had already captured dozens of runaways in prior years, they were confident this expedition would yield more success. They carried not only weapons, but also psychological weapons, chains, whips, and a reputation that preceded them. News of their arrival spread fast among the plantations, and enslaved people knew that once this party was in the area, attempts to escape could cost their lives. What made this particular hunting party so formidable was their knowledge of the Texas wilderness. They were not just tracking people, they were tracking people through forests, rivers, and swamplands that they knew intimately. They could read subtle signs in the environment, a broken twig, footprints in mud, disturbed grass, and follow them for miles. Their dogs, trained specifically to hunt human scent, were nearly unstoppable. It seemed as though any escape attempt would inevitably lead to capture or death. Yet, it was precisely this confidence and over-reliance on their skill that set the stage for what would happen next. The hunters moved through the countryside with arrogance, underestimating the intelligence, courage, and ingenuity of the people they pursued. This hubris would prove fatal. The enslaved and their allies, who had spent their entire lives under threat of violence, had learned to read the land in ways the hunters could not. Every path the hunters believed was secure, every predictable pattern they assumed, was known and anticipated by those they hunted. This initial setup, a party of confident, cruel, and highly skilled hunters, created the tension that would explode into a deadly reversal. The hunters entered the manhunt believing themselves in complete control, with every resource, every skill, and every advantage at their disposal. But in the wilds of Texas, control is never guaranteed, and in this case, it would be shattered completely. The small group of enslaved people and their allies who planned a daring escape were living under constant fear, yet their courage and ingenuity were unmatched. They had observed the hunters for months, quietly studying their habits, the times they traveled, and the routes they favored. These were people who knew the land better than anyone else. Every creek, every thicket, every hidden path in the dense Texas wilderness was familiar to them. They understood that survival would not come from confronting the hunter's head. It would come from patience, careful planning, and the element of surprise. Their plan was not spontaneous. It was meticulous. They chose a night when the hunters would be distracted. After a long day of tracking and assuming their prey was too exhausted to move, and plotted an escape that took advantage of every natural obstacle around the plantations and farms. Swamps, ravines, and dense forests became their allies, while the hunters saw them only as obstacles. The enslaved group knew that a single mistake could cost them their lives, so every step was calculated. They even staged false trails to mislead the hunters, breaking branches, covering footprints, and leaving objects in misleading positions to suggest movement in the wrong direction. Allies were crucial. They had help from other enslaved people on neighboring plantations, sympathetic neighbors, and even a few freed men who knew the terrain and could move unseen. Messages were passed quietly at night, and signals were exchanged using birdsong, knocks, or lantern positions, a secret communication system that the hunters never noticed. Each person in the group had a role. Some acted as decoys to lure the hunters away, while others led the main escape along hidden routes. On the night of the escape, tension hung thick in the air. The hunters, confident that their quarry had nowhere to hide, made their rounds unaware that the enslaved people had already moved. The escapees slipped silently through the shadows, using every skill they had honed over years of oppression. They crossed streams barefoot to avoid leaving a trace, hid under natural cover when the hunters drew near, and waited out the dogs, sniffing tracks in swamps where scent was distorted. Every breath, every movement was measured and deliberate. The ingenuity didn't end with physical survival. The escapees used psychological tactics to unsettle the hunters. They created sounds in the distance, a branch snapping here, a low grunt there, to mislead the hunters into thinking they were close. Smoke from controlled fires was used to suggest presence in one area while the main group moved silently in another. The hunters, trained to rely on tracking skills, began to follow the false signs without realizing it. By exploiting the hunters' confidence and assumptions, the escapees turned their pursuers' strength into a weakness. Their planning also accounted for exhaustion. They knew that the hunters, carrying heavy weapons and dogs, would tire faster than they would. The escapees moved in short bursts, resting in hidden hollows or submerged in water to remain undetected. They rationed food carefully, stole only what was necessary, and avoided open areas. It was a strategy of endurance, a battle of patience as much as of skill. By the time the hunters realized the escape had begun, the enslaved group was already ahead, using knowledge of the terrain to maintain a safe distance. The hunters' confidence, built on years of domination, began to falter as their traps failed and their dogs lost scent in the dense swamps. Each failure emboldened the escapees, who knew that the more the hunters searched blindly, the more vulnerable they became. This was not just a physical escape, but a mental one. The enslaved people had outsmarted men who believed themselves infallible, turning fear and oppression into resourcefulness and courage. Their determination and strategic thinking transformed the hunt, and in doing so, they set the stage for a reversal that no one, especially the hunters themselves, could have anticipated. The hunters, confident in their skills and experience, had no idea that the tables were about to turn. As the escapees moved quietly through the wilderness, the hunters followed the trails they assumed were real: broken branches, footprints, and other subtle signs planted deliberately by the fugitives. At first, it seemed as though the hunters were gaining ground, their hounds barking in the distance, the crack of rifles occasionally echoing through the trees. But with every step they took, they were moving deeper into a carefully orchestrated trap. The hunters' own assumptions and overconfidence were being used against them, turning their pursuit into a deadly game they were unprepared for. The first ambush came in a narrow ravine flanked by dense thickets. The escapees had studied the area and knew it was a place where the hunters' movements would be restricted. They had prepared it by breaking branches above and laying hidden snares designed to trip or entangle the dogs. When the hunters entered the ravine, their animals became tangled, barking and growling, while the escapees struck from the shadows, throwing rocks, creating noises from multiple directions to confuse and frighten them. Panic set in among the hunters, who had never imagined that their prey could use the environment against them. Every step of the manhunt became a series of calculated dangers for the hunters. The escapees had carefully considered the natural landscape: muddy swamps where the hunters' boots would sink, shallow rivers that masked scent trails, and dense underbrush that slowed movement while concealing the escapees entirely. The hunters, trained to pursue in open terrain, found themselves struggling, frustrated, and increasingly disoriented. Even their hounds, which had always been reliable, became confused by the clever use of water crossings, smoke, and false trails. Each misstep made the hunters more desperate, which in turn made them easier targets for ambushes. The escapees' psychological tactics were just as effective as their physical ones. At one point, the hunters believed they were closing in on the main group, only to find that the sounds of movement they were following were created by decoys, hidden figures rustling in the leaves, throwing rocks, or creating noises from behind trees. The hunters, thinking they were about to capture their prey, rushed into traps where they would become vulnerable to strikes from hidden positions. Some hunters were injured, others separated from the group, and fear began to replace their earlier arrogance. The ingenuity of the escapees became even clearer as they used the hunters' expectations against them. The hunters anticipated linear pursuit, that their quarry would move predictably from one landmark to another. But the escapees moved unpredictably, circling back through previously passed areas while leaving no traces. They anticipated the hunters' strategies, leading them into dead ends and misleading tracks. The hunters began doubting their own judgment, unsure which way the fugitives had gone. That uncertainty created tension and mistakes, which the escapees exploited mercilessly. By the second night, the hunters were exhausted and demoralized. They had been moving almost non-stop, carrying heavy rifles and supplies, while navigating unfamiliar terrain. The escapees, in contrast, had been traveling lightly and resting strategically. They had also used natural shelters like hollow trees, riverbanks, and brush piles to stay hidden. The hunters' reliance on brute force and experience alone could not match the escapees' intimate knowledge of the land. Combined with their careful planning, the hunters' mistakes became fatal. They began to split up in panic, chasing illusions and phantom sounds. In doing so, they exposed themselves to attacks from all directions, rocks hurled from unseen hands, noises mimicking larger groups, and hidden traps in the swamps and ravines. A combination of fear, exhaustion, and misjudgment turned the hunters' own aggression against them. By the time the manhunt reached its peak, it was clear that the hunted had become the hunters' masters. Through every ambush, every false trail, and every disorienting maneuver, the escapees demonstrated not only courage, but a tactical brilliance born of necessity. They had studied the hunters, understood their psychology, and turned their overconfidence into vulnerability. What began as a routine pursuit had transformed into a deadly reversal, one that no one, not even the most ruthless slave hunters of Texas, could have anticipated. By the time the story of this manhunt spread across the region, it was no longer just about escaped enslaved people. It became a legend of how the oppressed could outwit and even overpower those who thought themselves invincible. As the manhunt progressed, it became painfully clear that the hunters were no longer in control. The tables had turned, and the hunters, once feared for their ruthlessness, were now the hunted. Their confidence, which had carried them through years of tracking enslaved people across Texas, began to crumble under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and relentless pursuit. Every step they took, every decision they made, seemed to play into the hands of those they had sought to capture. One of the most pivotal moments came in a thick, shadowed part of the forest where the escapees had prepared an intricate trap. The hunters, thinking they were closing in on their quarry, followed faint tracks that led them into a narrow valley surrounded by dense underbrush. The escapees, hidden above and around the ravine, struck first. Rocks tumbled from the trees, and branches snapped sharply, startling the hunters' horses and dogs. The men scrambled to regain their footing, slipping into mud and water as the sound of the attack echoed through the woods. Panic set in as they realized they were surrounded, disoriented, and unable to see their attackers. The escapees, understanding of the land, gave them an advantage that the hunters could not counter. They had memorized the swampy riverbanks, the thick groves of trees, and the hidden hollows where they could lie in wait. The hunters, despite their experience, were unfamiliar with these particular paths. When they tried to chase what they thought was the main group, they were led into areas where the ground was treacherous, with hidden pits and slick mud that caused horses to stumble and riders to fall. The chaos allowed the escapees to strike from multiple angles, using the hunters' confusion against them. Psychological warfare played a crucial role in turning the tide. The escapees used noise, shadows, and movement to give the illusion of a larger force than actually existed. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a branch, every faint cry in the distance made the hunters believe they were constantly being watched and outnumbered. Exhausted and on edge, the hunters began to argue among themselves, accusing each other of mistakes and lost opportunities. Their cohesion broke down, and fear overtook their skill. The hunters' dogs, once a key advantage, also became liabilities. In areas where the escapees had crossed rivers or swamps, scents were intentionally masked or misdirected. The dogs became confused, barking and lunging in the wrong directions. Some ran off, never to return, while others became injured in the treacherous terrain. Without their canine companions, the hunters lost both speed and confidence, and the escapees capitalized on every misstep. One dramatic moment occurred near the banks of a winding creek. The hunters had followed a false trail to what they believed was the escapees' hiding spot. As they moved along the muddy edge, the fugitives struck from the shadows, dislodging logs and rocks to create barriers and block their path. The hunters' horses panicked, throwing riders into the water, and in the chaos, one of the men was seriously injured, unable to continue. Panic spread among the group as they realized that the escapees were not only anticipating their moves, but actively controlling the terrain. The combination of exhaustion, fear, and disorientation reached a peak as night fell. The hunters, who had always relied on their ability to navigate and dominate the wilderness, now found themselves blindly moving through it, unsure where they were or what dangers awaited them. The escapees took full advantage of the darkness, moving silently through familiar paths, always staying just out of reach, while keeping the hunters off balance. Every attempt by the hunters to regroup or counterattack was met with clever deception. False trails, sudden noises, and strategic retreats that lured them deeper into danger. By the time dawn broke, the hunters were physically and mentally broken. Some were injured, some had abandoned their weapons, and others had fled in terror, leaving behind their supplies and dogs. The once feared party that had ruled over the land with cruelty and intimidation was reduced to a group of frightened men barely able to move. The escapees, in contrast, had maintained cohesion, skill, and control throughout the night. They had turned the hunters' own tactics against them, demonstrating not only courage but extraordinary intelligence and strategic planning. This reversal of roles, the hunters becoming the hunted, became the defining moment of the Manhunt. The story spread quickly across Texas, and it was told and retold as a cautionary tale that those who wield power with cruelty could themselves fall victim to the cleverness and resilience of those they oppressed. By the time the surviving hunters made their way back to safety, the entire narrative of dominance had been shattered. The once proud hunters were no longer feared. Instead, they were regarded as examples of overconfidence punished by circumstance and intelligence far greater than their own. The escapees' success in turning the Manhunt on its head demonstrated that knowledge, unity, and cunning could overcome even the most powerful oppressors. It was not just an act of survival, but a stunning lesson in strategy and bravery. A story that would echo through the region for decades to come, reminding everyone that even the hunters could become prey. The aftermath of the deadly reversal left a lasting mark on the local communities in Texas. News of the hunters' defeat spread quickly, carried along by word of mouth from neighboring plantations, farms, and settlements. What had begun as a routine manhunt had become a cautionary tale, whispered in the fields, around hearths, and at market gatherings. Families who had long feared the hunters now viewed them with a mix of awe and dread. They had seen the hunters fall prey to the very people they sought to control, and it challenged the perception of power and dominance that had long ruled the region. The escapees themselves became legends in the communities that helped them. Though many remained in hiding or continued to flee further into the wilderness, their bravery was celebrated, Tales of their cunning and strategic planning were told repeatedly, often exaggerated, but always with a kernel of truth. They had outsmarted men who were considered ruthless and nearly unbeatable. This story became an inspiration to others living under oppression, a reminder that knowledge, resourcefulness, and courage could overturn even the most terrifying forces. Meanwhile, the surviving hunters returned to their homes, some barely able to walk, others nursing injuries that would take months to heal. Their reputation, once untouchable, was tarnished. Plantation owners who had relied on their services began to hesitate, uncertain whether these hunters could be trusted to complete future assignments. The hunters themselves were changed, physically weakened but more profoundly shaken in spirit. For the first time, many of them experienced fear not as a tool to wield, but as a force directed toward them. And it was a fear that they could not easily shake. Communities in the surrounding areas also felt the impact. Enslaved populations, long subjected to terror and constant surveillance, saw a shift in the balance of power, however temporary. They witnessed firsthand that the hunters were not invincible, that cleverness and knowledge of the land could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. While daily life remained harsh and oppressive, the story of the manhunt became a source of hope and resilience, passed from one generation to the next. Parents would whisper the tale to their children as a warning to respect the land, to be smart, and to remain vigilant, lessons that were crucial for survival. The local authorities, meanwhile, were placed in a difficult position. The manhunt had turned deadly, and they could not ignore the fact that hired hunters had been defeated and injured. Some attempted to downplay the events, framing them as unfortunate accidents, while others quietly investigated, fearing that news of the hunters' defeat might encourage more bold resistance or rebellion among the enslaved population. Despite their efforts, the story persisted, as stories of courage and reversal are rarely contained, particularly in regions where oppression is daily reality. Economically, the manhunt's failure had consequences as well. Plantation owners who depended on the hunters' skills to retrieve escaped enslaved people faced increased risk of loss. The story of hunters becoming the hunted spread through the network of plantations, causing some owners to consider alternative approaches or pay closer attention to the risks of overconfidence. The psychological impact of the hunters' defeat often outweighed any financial loss. Fear and uncertainty replaced the sense of control that had previously dominated the region. Perhaps most significantly, the manhunt and its outcome became part of the oral history of Texas. Songs, stories, and folk tales incorporated elements of the event, embedding the narrative into the cultural memory of the communities affected. The tale of the hunters, who had once ruled with cruelty, only to be outsmarted and ambushed, served as a symbolic reversal of power. It demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, intelligence, planning, and courage could subvert oppression, a lesson that resonated far beyond the immediate participants in the event. For historians and storytellers, the incident became a reference point for understanding both the brutality of the period and the remarkable resilience of those who endured it. The manhunt illustrated that oppression, no matter how entrenched, was not absolute. The hunters' defeat underscored a crucial truth: knowledge, preparation, and unity could turn the tables, even in situations that seemed hopeless. The escapees, now part of Texas folklore, became enduring symbols of resistance, courage, and the clever use of one's environment to survive. In the decades that followed, the story was retold with reverence and awe, serving as a reminder that power is never guaranteed. The hunters who once inspired terror became cautionary figures, and the communities that witnessed the reversal carried the lessons forward. The deadly manhunt of 1856 was no longer just a story of pursuit. It became a story of survival, strategy, and the reversal of fate, a narrative that highlighted the ingenuity and resilience of those who refused to be controlled, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Texas.